Welcome to this podcast on digital responsibility. There's a vibrant community across the world at the moment driving forward corporate digital responsibility, which includes a range of aspects from digital ethics, digital for the environment, sustainability, digital well-being, inclusion, accessibility, and more. My name is Rob Price, one of the founders of Corporate Digital Responsibility back in 2017. If you'd like to know more, have a look at the website corporatedigitalresponsibility.net. And welcome to the second episode of the CDR podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Tom Greenwood and Tim Frick. Tom, would you like to introduce yourself and talk a bit about what you're bringing to the podcast tonight?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Tom Greenwood and I run a web design agency in London called Wholegrain Digital, and we're specialists in design and development of WordPress, but with a specific focus on web performance and sustainability. And today, I guess what I bring is insights into the environmental impact of digital technology and what we can do to solve that.
That's great. And Tim, conscious that kind of some of the conversations we've had over the last few months have been very firmly in that space too. So how about yourself?
Sure, yeah. My name is Tim Frick, and I started a company called Mighty Bytes, which is very similar to Wholegrain Digital. We are a BCorp. We focus on WordPress, and we work with mission-driven organizations. And so I can bring that angle to the table. We've been focused on environmental sustainability of digital products and services for a while, and more recently have been kind of broadening that out to include, social considerations of digital and economic considerations alongside environmental.
I'm now intrigued as to kind of, given the focus that both of you on WordPress specifically, is that because it is the most environmentally product in this space, or is that coincidence?
For us at Wholegrain, certainly it's a coincidence. I mean, WordPress is certainly not the most environmentally friendly website technology out of the box, and we use it more because it provides many benefits to our clients from a user point of view. But being open source means that you can actually tailor it to do kind of whatever you want. And so we've really focused on looking at how do we make WordPress really, really efficient, rather than starting with a really efficient technology that's not very user-friendly. We've come from the other direction.
Okay, cool. And of course, the other thing that you've both got in common is both published authors in terms of this passion that you both have to drive kind of environmental and sustainable positive outcomes through the kind of use of the technologies in the way in which you enable organizations to interact with end consumers. Do you want to kind of both talk a bit about the books that you produced, and Tom, do you want to start with Sustainable Web Design?
Yeah, sure. So I published Sustainable Web Design in February this year, so it's quite recent, and it's basically it's a quick introduction to the issue of sustainability within the web design sector and what we can do about it in sort of planning, design, development, hosting, and the business side of how do we sell that? How do we convince stakeholders to embed sustainability into their project? So it's a quick guide that you could read in a weekend on this topic.
And when did people start thinking about it? I suppose the reason I asked the question is, as organizations globally more and more are trying to understand the impact that they have on the planet and to do something about that, how many of them are going to be thinking we must do something about the way in which kind of we manage our presence on the internet and the energy that consumes? What kind of reaction have you had?
Well, I mean, it's a very early days, this topic. It's strange. I find it strange that an industry that is so forward thinking is so behind the curve in talking about environmental issues. And we're finding that in the last 12 months, there's more and more people talking about it. There seems to be a bit of momentum building in the industry that people are interested in this topic. But certainly for us, it has been something that is only really just started recently. The people are coming to us and talking. But Tim's been talking about this for many years, and he's way ahead of the curve in the industry. So, Tim may have a different perspective.
You know, I agree with you that even it's encouraging now in 2021 to see people talking about this topic. Back in 2011, 12, when we were first starting to kind of formulate our ideas around it and thinking about how we could do what we do differently, you know, optimize WordPress and you know, create efficiencies and power our services and products with renewable energy. When we were starting to think about all of that stuff, it just wasn't on anybody's radar. And one of the reasons we created our tool EcoGrader and the Sustainable Web Design website that Tom's company and Mighty Bytes retooled earlier this year in advance of his book coming out, were just to kind of provide awareness, because we were finding that so many people were just not aware of this idea, and it wasn't even registering for them. They still thought about the internet replacing paper. You know, and so the internet was the green medium, so they didn't have to think about any of that kind of stuff. And you know, I think it even goes back to, like, you know, if you were around in the 90s and you saw pictures of the internet in business communications, it was a cloud. It was like you know, it was literally a cloud, like an obfuscated thing that people didn't really understand. But yet, you know, those of us in communications and design and technology, and especially on the communications and design side, we're really excited about building that thing. And so there's definitely a lack of awareness, I think, of the environmental points, as Tom was saying, that could potentially go into this. And the idea is that it was just, you know, something that was invisible and didn't have any kind of weight or depth or breadth to it. That, you know, pixels were you know, better than paper, as we said earlier.
I think it's fascinating that you guys have seen that shift in the sector. I love your point, Tom, about being amazed at how the sector can be so behind the curve, yet outwardly appear so innovative and leading in many respects. I guess another element of the shift we're seeing in society and how being green and socially responsible is becoming more of a trendy thing that customers are more want to see from their customers is this concept of greenwashing and organizations outwardly looking green and saying all the right things, but not necessarily inherently changing their processes drastically from the way they worked before. I guess your tooling, your website, and your books really help to cut through some of that. Some of those outward strategies and branding right to the heart of, well, how are you performing today? How can we quantify that?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I don't want to speak for Tom, but I think that's one of the reasons that both of our companies are B Corps. Like, we build the idea of these things into the very DNA of our company. We want everything that our company does to kind of all row in the same direction. And for both of us, it's really, climate change is a big issue, and so is digital. And so we want to make sure that those things are kind of aligned in you know, our finance and our operations and our HR and all the things that we do to run our organizations. And the B Corp framework is a great way to do that. I don't know if you have anything to add to that thought, Tom, but that's for Mighty Bytes, that's a big thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, that's one of the reasons why we put so much out there into the, you know, sort of wider community in terms of content and tools that, you know, both of our companies build and collaborate on, because we want to see real action rather than just marketing messages. And, yes, you know, there are a lot of, especially the big tech companies, some of them are doing some good things, but there's also an awful lot of, like, just marketing gloss. And it's very hard, you know, from the outside to tell the difference, and so we're just trying to kind of lead the way in taking real action rather than just talk.
And I guess there's been many people who've done exactly what I did when I first came across EcoGrader and Website Carbon, which was to put in lots of websites for lots of organizations that I knew and loved, just to see kind of what insights it did give. And it was fascinating. To the extent of determining whether it was powered by renewable energy or the design and the way in which the kind of site was built. Tim, in your book, you talk about clicks in terms of the carbon impact of a click versus the carbon impact of a kilometre in a car. But of course, when a website like Google is getting billions of clicks, right, then those things add up. What's been surprising in terms of some of the things that you've found?
Yeah, I mean, that is true. I think that the whole concept of Jevons paradox of, you know, the easier and more accessible a thing is, the more people are going to use it. And I think, the internet is that case in point. We've seen that happen throughout, the last few hundred years, and progress and innovation and stuff. But the internet is definitely the home to that. And getting back to the point we were talking about earlier, where, we're seeing broadening of tools and like WordPress and things available and open source and readily available, but maybe less of quality control around a lot of that kind of stuff, because the tools are readily available, so anybody can use them. And that doesn't necessarily mean, Tom and I have exactly the same kind of outlook on how we use the tools that we choose to use for our business, but not everybody does. And so, when you're talking about, billions of people online, and many of those people are using these tools, you have the problems that we run into, where many people are not considering the environmental impact of what they're doing. And so the challenges, run amok when you're talking about billions and billions of people. I think in terms of some of the surprising things for me, it really was, I was, kind of gobsmacked in the early days when I was looking at all of this kind of stuff and realizing just how big, the environmental impact was. And there's a challenge in reaching consensus on that. People are talking about, annual greenhouse gas emissions in the billions of tons. But exactly how you measure that, there seems to be a lot of kind of flexibility around that. And Tom and I have talked about this a lot, and trying to figure out exactly, I love website carbon because it gives you a place to start. You can go and say, oh, well, each page of my website, could potentially, emit this much CO2 equivalent. And so, I appreciate the fact that there's something really quantifiable there, understanding that, one page and another might not be right down to the exact same thing. And so, getting more clarity around this stuff, I think, is really, really important.
And have you found organizations who've approached either of you and said, look, kind of, we've measured our impact on your sites or otherwise, we want to optimize our web presence for the lowest emissions possible. So what can we do differently? What's best practice, if you like, for minimizing that? And how have you helped them?
Yeah, sure. So I would say only really in the last 12 months. So prior to that, it was sort of our regular clients would come to us with their regular briefs, and we would then try to talk to them about embedding the sustainability aspect into it. And even if they weren't interested, we'd do it anyway, because there's no downside for them. However, slowly in the last 12 months, like a year ago, we got our first brief through the door that had this written into it, that they wanted to reduce their emissions. And then since then, it's steadily kind of increased. And we've also been talking, getting more inquiries from people who actually, they don't want us to build on a website. They just want some consulting. They've got their own in-house teams that manage their web technology. And really what they want is for us to help educate their in-house teams so that they can then do it themselves.
Back in 2014, I think, I was on the board of an organization called Climate Ride, and they, the fact that I was on the board, I'm sure had a lot to do with this, but they really wanted to use EcoGrader to kind of benchmark where they were at. And so we did a full case study, and we published it, I think, on Sustainable Brands. But, that was based on their EcoGrader score. At the time, there was not a consensus around what a page view was worth and stuff. There was a lot of conflicting information. In fact, I wrote an entire chapter about that in Designing for Sustainability. My goal for the chapter was to say, how much CO2e does a web page emit, and I couldn't get a solid answer. And I asked everybody. I asked academics, I asked other business people, I asked sustainability consultants, and everybody gave me the lawyer answer of it depends. So, which is good, and understand, it's good to understand that, but it was we couldn't base our kind of performance for the Climate Ride website on specific emissions. So we based it on our EcoGrader score, and we got them, I think they had a 40% or 40 point improvement spread on that. But very rarely, I don't think we've yet have had a client come to us saying that that's what they want it's usually us having to talk to them first, or convince them of that first, or they'll say, oh, I didn't know you did that. That's really interesting. And then they're open to the idea and the concepts and the discussions. But, people, I kind of envy those of you over in Europe, because you tend to be further ahead of the US on this, and especially the Midwest, the American Midwest. It's just, I feel like, there's not a lot of drive towards kind of this level of innovation, at least that I've seen, in the geographic region that I live in. And I'd love to see that change.
Yeah, and that's something that digital responsibility and corporate digital responsibility more broadly, as doing digital transformation, using digital for a fundamentally positive impact on our society, environment being a core element of that. And that tension between us pushing this message of and advocating the right things to do versus the market and organizations pulling it and asking for that insight. I think that's a really important tension in our corporate society, I suppose, at the moment. One thing that's always interested me is what the trigger point is going to be. What's the action that's going to drive people over? Perhaps that we've seen a corporate social responsibility elsewhere all of a sudden is on the front page of the news. It's the thing that the citizen now cares a lot about. What might be the driver of this in our digital space? Is it going to come from a political activist perspective? Is it going to come from a regulator of the market? Do you guys have any opinion on what might continue and to shift people into this agenda going forward?
It's hard to know, but I recently facilitated a session on this topic at the Mozilla Festival, and we asked the same question to the group, and most people seem to feel that, like, it's to get it really onto the agenda of like most companies is probably either going to take some form of regulation or some form of major scandal. The examples being like GDPR as regulation and the Facebook scandal, kind of in the privacy world, and something equivalent on the environmental level. But nobody wants a scandal, and nobody wants regulations that aren't necessarily going to drive the right type of action. And so, in a way, it's difficult. I think in a way, what we need to do is try to lead a positive path forward, whereby we can show best practices, and we can work collaboratively as an industry to actually figure out how we're going to solve these problems. And then if regulations come, they can be based off that knowledge of how we're going to solve it, rather than being based off bad things having happened.
Yeah, I think quantifiable case studies is the term that I would use, and that there's not been enough of those. I think, we've focused our work on this for a while, and we struggle with that. And it's just having more case studies of more people who have had a very measurable impact we've talked about there are no downsides to all of this. Your sites are typically more accessible, they're faster, they perform better, all these other things. Businesses want that, and as long as sustainability is folded into the mix of that, everybody wins. But sustainability has to be in its lane there. I mean, it has to be part of the conversation.
I guess kind of being a beacon, showing the art of the possible, getting more people on board with what can be done. I mean, maybe a good time to mention the Sustainable Web Manifesto. I was looking at, actually, from a CDR point of view, in terms of what would a CDR manifesto look like when I first came across it. But has that been a mechanism that's got raised awareness, got more people on board, created a degree of acceleration maybe over the last 12 months, in common with some of the other things? Obviously, I mean, we talked previously on the podcast around digital adoption acceleration through the pandemic. Anything that you'd kind of touch on there?
I think the manifesto did get attention and got people talking and thinking, and it brought a bunch of us in the industry who were thinking about these things together, which I think was really powerful. But I also think that the things that seem to have been more powerful levers of change, other tools like EcoGrader and Website Carbon, where it's giving some people something practical that they can actually use in their projects. And so I think the manifesto has been great in terms of just sort of setting a philosophy out, like let's have this conversation and getting it on the agenda. But the tools have actually been getting into real projects, and I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, agree.
One of the things I think Tim, we might have talked about it before, but when we've had the conversation, I'd kind of moved almost kind of into thinking about the entirety of the IT strategy. So designing everything in, architecting everything in for environmental outcomes and what that might look like. I mean, I think we talked about trying to understand the environmental impact of different coding languages, for example, to understand, would that begin to influence the choices that you would make in an organization about one tech stack versus another tech stack? It was almost not just around performance or cost, but impact on environment from an energy use or efficiency of code or things like that. Is there anything that you've seen? Is that a conversation that's happened elsewhere?
Sure. So I actually do talk about this in my book in terms of coding languages and the relative efficiency. And I think it's really interesting in the sense that if there was like wide awareness of the sort of energy consumption of performing the same tasks in different programming languages, then that would inform not just what programming languages you use as your tech stack at a corporate level, but I think it could also inform what programming languages you choose to learn as a developer at university, when they're teaching computer science at universities and so on. I think it's something that should be talked about more, and I don't think it is talked about really. So yeah, I think that would be a good angle.
And interestingly enough, in my experience, universities seem to be very open to this. Just in the last week alone, I've spoken at 3 different universities around sustainable web design and CDR concepts and stuff, and they're definitely really intrigued by the idea and want to learn more. So I'm hoping that's a positive sign that it's only a matter of time that before universities start coming up with their own curriculum around this stuff, because once you get people out into the workforce saying, hey, these are the things that I need in order to do the job I want to do, to have the impact I want to have. That's when change starts to really spread out across sectors.
And I think it probably, as you're talking, it takes time sometimes to move from academic environments into corporate world in terms of changing behaviours, adopting kind of different ways of working. What maybe in terms of thinking of something to finish on, what would be your hope or message to listeners of the podcast? What would you ask them to think about differently over the next 12 months, maybe, in moving sustainable web design, or indeed the broader kind of thinking about the entirety of the tech stack for environmental benefit? What's the ask?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess the ask really from my side is start talking about it. Because this is a conversation that we should have been having as a mainstream conversation, a decade ago when Tim started talking about it. And we're only just starting now as an industry. So I think the first step is get everybody talking about it, and that will then lead to the people figuring out what they're actually going to do as solutions.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would maybe just adjust that a little bit based on who I'm talking to. There are within the B Corp community, for instance, lots and lots of conversations happening around net zero commitments and stuff. And, sustainable web design commitments and green hosting commitments should be hand in hand with those conversations, and they're not yet. And so, but if I'm talking to B Corps, I know that I have a relatively open-minded audience that would be open to these ideas. If I'm talking to designers and developers, I may adjust that language a little bit and say, this is how this is going to impact the work that you do. And when you go out into the organizations that you're going to work for, or when you potentially start your own thing, ground your work in these principles, and so just really depending on who I'm talking to, I might adjust the language a little bit, but the idea being that, as Tom said, let's have these conversations and let's figure out how to get these tools into everybody's hands.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you, Tom and Tim, for your time on today's podcast. It's been fascinating to hear about your work and hugely exciting about the steps that we're taking in this step, and long may that conversation that we're seeking to bring about continue and get more and more loud, so that more and more people can hear it.